Hello students, and welcome back to another lecture for sexualities and social issues. Today, we are going to talk about commercialization. So you've probably heard the phrase sex sells, and indeed it does. We use it to sell all sorts of products that are clearly unrelated to sex, like hamburgers, very popular. But what we're going to talk about today is how we sell sex itself. So the technical definition of commercialization is the process of managing or running something principally for financial gain. So sex, technically, is free, but we have invented a lot of ways to sell it or representations of it to each other. So today, we're going to talk about four main things. First, we're going to talk about pornography, the visual aspect of sex. Then, we're going to talk about live performance, things like burlesque and strip clubs. Then, we will talk about the products you can get to make your sex life better, even though it's probably fine. And last, we're going to talk about prostitution, the world's oldest profession and the literal selling of sex. So, we have a lot to cover today, so let's get started. So we're going to start with pornography, in part because humans love pornography. So one of the first things that I wanted to talk about is how difficult it can be to define pornography. It can be very difficult to draw the line between a nude statue and pornography, for instance. So here is one of the technical definitions. The representation in books, magazines, photographs, films, and other media of scenes of sexual behavior that are erotic or lewd and are designed to arouse sexual interest. So that's kind of the key part here, is that basically a piece of art is designed to create erotic interest. So that's kind of where we tend to draw the line between something that is art and something that is porn. But it's very difficult. So for instance, if you look at these two pictures, which one is art and which one is porn? Are both of them art? Are both of them porn? The one on the right is a relatively famous Mapplethorpe photograph, and you'll notice that it doesn't really look pornographic except that we can see his genitals. The same with the one on the left. There are entire websites dedicated to this subject. One of the most famous definitions of pornography came from the Supreme Court case, where they were trying to decide if pornography could be mailed through the mail. And the Supreme Court justice said, "I don't know how to define pornography, but I know it when I see it." And weirdly enough, that is kind of where we draw the line. Basically, it can be hard to tell if something is art or pornography. Sometimes we care, sometimes we don't care. But basically, we define it by our cultural values at the time. We know it when we see it. So next, let's talk about the place of porn in our current world. Pornography is a big business. We think that in the past couple of years, it's generated roughly $35 billion per year in profits. That's an extraordinary amount of money. And it helps to explain how much money it makes when we consider the fact that up to 10 to 12% of all web content is pornography. So we're going to look at a couple of graphs. This first graph tells us how much money porn has made compared to other kinds of US entertainment industries. So you'll notice that it can be kind of difficult to gauge how much money porn has made because people lie. But basically, at the low end, it might have made $6 billion, at the high end, $15 billion, and this was in 2018 in America alone. By comparison, you'll notice that some of these other industries make a lot of money. The NFL made $14 billion, Netflix made about $12. But if you estimate on the high end of pornography, it is by far the biggest entertainment money-making industry in America. So what are people spending all that time looking at, you ask? I'll tell you. One thing you should know is that the website Pornhub keeps beautiful data. They don't attach your name to it, but they do know exactly what you watched and how often and what time and what day. So we're going to look at a couple of the graphs that Pornhub made for us so I can tell you what's going on in the world of pornography. In this first graph, we have a basic overview of what is happening every minute on Pornhub. So you'll notice that there are more than 80,000 visits with 77,000 searches. But one of the things that I'd like to draw your attention to is not just the amount of videos that people watch, but the amount of content that's uploaded every minute. So 14 different videos are uploaded every minute, creating 2.8 hours of content. And what that means is that we're generating an extraordinary amount of new content, which is being eagerly consumed by the people who are watching. What specifically are they watching, you ask? These are the most viewed categories by gender. So for one thing, it's true that women also watch porn, but it is also true that they look for slightly different things than men look for. So you'll notice on the left, these are the categories that women tend to search. On the right, these are the categories that men tend to search. But one thing that's really interesting that Pornhub measures is the degree of difference between what is consumed by women and what is consumed by men. For instance, you'll notice that the categories that are viewed by women tend to be a lot more focused on female enjoyment. They tend to be more focused on female participation, and there's a lot less aggressive or violent energy in the films that women tend to choose. Maybe you're surprised by the fact that women watch it all. Here is a graph of the proportion of female visitors broken down by country. Pornhub does, of course, have a worldwide audience, but you'll notice here that it does vary, the highest in the Philippines and Brazil, but the lowest in Russia and Germany. This is kind of an interesting statement in regard to how free women feel to be watching pornography, and of course, it is specific to this website, so you can't necessarily measure everything against it, but it is an interesting way of thinking about how many women make up the viewership of this website. Another interesting thing to think about is that different countries prefer different varieties of pornography. These are essentially the most searched terms in each country. You'll notice that lesbian tends to be a big winner, but you'll also notice that people tend to search for pornography that features actors who look like them. This is kind of an interesting thing. Basically, Americans don't necessarily search for Americans, but in a lot of other countries, people are interested in watching pornography that features actors and actresses who resemble them. Here is a graph of the most viewed categories of 2019, and worldwide, you'll notice that Japanese wins, which is super interesting. After that, it does tend to be pretty regular in terms of like lesbian, amateur, the usual. Finally, one thing that I thought was particularly interesting was that pornography viewage does differ based on holidays. So essentially, the lowest day of traffic for pornography is New Year's Eve, presumably because everybody's out partying. The second lowest day, Christmas Eve, hopefully because they're home with their families. On the reverse side, the highest day, Valentine's. Possibly those are the people who are feeling lonely and single, but I don't know, maybe that's what couples are doing together. The other thing, which is particularly interesting and timely, is that Pornhub tracked the amount of traffic they got as soon as the pandemic hit in 2020. So you'll notice here that they were having a pretty regular sort of surge up and down, but as soon as people started getting locked in their houses, there was a huge uptick in the viewing of pornography. You gotta do something, I guess, when you're home alone. So all of that data was from the internet, of course, but in the olden days, people had to go to stores to buy pornography. So it used to be that separate, special stores sold things that were considered pornographic. You weren't really allowed to sell things that were pornographic at other stores. Sometimes you could if you covered up the front. You may have seen that in magazines at gas stations or something. But in the olden days, separate, dedicated stores existed for the purchase of pornography. As technology changed, pornography changed. Like I have said before, we have used every possible medium to make pornography for ourselves. So it used to be that you would have to go and rent pornography, or you would have to go and watch it at someone else's store and then leave and go home. It's kind of nice that we don't do that anymore because I think people prefer the privacy of their own home, but pornography and technology have always been really closely related. For instance, pornography has dictated a lot of the kinds of technology that we choose to use. So way back before most of you were born, there was sort of a competition between VHS tape and Betamax. And the main reason that the VHS format won was because they were using it for pornography. The same thing sort of happened with Blu-ray and CD-ROM. The same thing happened with the invention of the internet and the way that we sent large files. So basically, every time that we develop a new form of technology, we use it for pornography, and sometimes to good effect. The main thing that's happening these days has to do with using live webcams, and it has to do with pay-per-views, and it even has to do with subscription services. So we are constantly using the technology at hand to view more pornography. Now, I am not porn averse, but I do want to be clear that it can have some negative effects. One of the things that we've been seeing is that because there is so much readily available porn, it's kind of changing the way that people think about pornography, and it might even be changing the wiring of your brain. So basically, like everything else we like, when you view something that turns you on, you get dopamine, and you get serotonin, and you get adrenaline, and you get all the good chemicals. So one of the things that's happening is that people have to view more porn, or they have to view weirder porn, or they have to view more excessive acts in order to get the same level of arousal that they previously experienced. So whereas people used to just be able to use their imagination or a still photograph or something like that, what we're finding is that for a lot of regular internet porn users, it takes more and more and more stimulation, and sometimes what we're seeing is that unusually young men are experiencing erectile dysfunction. Basically, they've trained their brains to be obsessed with new information and new pictures and essentially new people. So when they find that they are faced with the same partner over and over, sometimes they can't get excited. So this is kind of an unusual thing that we haven't seen before, because even though people have been worried about porn consumption since the beginning of time, the internet has given us access to the kinds of things that we never could have seen before. So what we're seeing is that a lot of people are experiencing negative reactions from viewing too much. So as with all things, moderation. We're also seeing that porn sort of changes their ideas about what sex will be like or about what human bodies will be like. So we've talked before about the super unrealistic physical standards that exist in pornography, but it's also important to mention that most human sex does not look like that. The sex that they're having in pornography is designed specifically to be able to get the right camera angles, and humans who are having normal sex by themselves so that they both enjoy it are not necessarily that photogenic. So if you see porn and you feel like you need to act that out, please believe me when I tell you nobody wants that. That's just a visual thing. So pornography, and again, watching too much of it, can create negative impacts, and it can create false expectations. But like cookies and everything else that is good, you can enjoy it in moderation. One big question about pornography right now concerns the future of pornography. So for decades, the people who were in the pornography did not also produce the pornography. And in fact, they weren't allowed to collect any of the profits. They were paid for a one-time act, but it didn't matter how many times people watched it after that. They just got one flat payment. But now, we are seeing a huge rise in self-produced pornography, largely due to amateur videos and sites like OnlyFans, where the same people who make it make the money. So this is kind of a huge change. This is very sociological, right? The workers owning the means of production. So one of the things that we're seeing is that a lot of the women, especially, who act in the porn films are now feeling a little bit more empowered, because they are now the ones who are benefiting from their actions. So a lot of people are living solely off of the money that they make, doing camgirl things or doing OnlyFans things, because the results of their actions come directly right back to them. So this is kind of an interesting time in pornography, in terms of who's making it, who's watching it, and who is profiting. So we haven't seen this before. One thing that we're very curious about is what will happen to these women, especially afterwards. So historically, the life of porn stars after they stop making porn has not been great. Very often people only get into pornography because they don't have any other options, but there's also a stigma about having made pornography. So there are some excellent documentaries about this that I would suggest that you watch, especially if you're locked in your house. But there's also some interesting considerations of whether we should allow people who, for instance, also have an OnlyFans account to have other jobs. Is it okay if your mechanic has also made porn? Or what about your elementary school teacher? These are kind of interesting questions, especially in an age where a lot of people film themselves, even if they don't sell those videos. So our ideas about who porn stars are rapidly changing with our ability to create our own content. The final thing to talk about in regard to pornography is child pornography. And I want to be clear that child pornography is a whole separate thing. A whole separate thing. Most people prefer adults. They prefer sex partners of their own age. We think that pedophilia is essentially a deep mental illness. So the kinds of people who are watching child pornography are not the same people who are watching the other kinds of pornography. Quite frankly, the other kinds of pornography don't do anything for them. So pedophilia is its own mental illness and its own problem and its own specific crime. But that doesn't mean that people don't produce pornography for those people to watch. So child pornography is reckoned to be a pretty big business, maybe about $8 billion a year worldwide. And the problem is that we catch very few people who are related to it, who are involved in making it and producing it. So maybe we catch about 0.1% of the people who view and produce child pornography. And this is a huge problem because every rational human agrees that no one should do that, and anyone who does do it should be punished severely. But it's very difficult to find them, it's very difficult to track them, and it's very difficult to get that evidence. So again, I just wanted to be clear that it is called pornography and it is sort of related to sex, I guess, but it's not anything like the other kinds of pornography that we talk about today. And while I think it is okay for you to view adult pornography in moderation, I think we can all agree that child pornography is off limits. So next, we are going to talk about live performance. So while live stage shows of the sex act do exist, what we're going to talk about is dancing. So erotic dancing has existed, again, for millennia. People have always liked to watch other people dance in ways that remind them of sex. But it is especially popular, and historically has been especially popular, to watch women. So again, for millennia, men have paid to watch women dance in ways that they find sexy. But there are a lot of forms this kind of dancing has taken. So for instance, historically, where there were a lot of laws regarding public nudity and regarding indecency that people figured out really clever ways around. So you may have heard of burlesque, and it's also sort of having a resurgence. But basically burlesque is erotic dancing, but there tends to be a storyline, or there tends to be props or a theme or something like that. Historically, burlesque has been incredibly popular, even if the dancers never got fully naked, because in some cultures, just seeing their knees was pretty exciting. So burlesque tends to have a lot of props involved. You may have seen fans or something like that. But over the course of time, it's also taken a lot of forms. So for instance, there used to be a law that said that you can be nude, but not if you're in motion. And some theaters figured out an amazing way around this, which is that they staged these tableaus on the stage of the theater, and they would open the curtains, and everyone would hold completely still, but naked, and then they would close the curtains. And then everyone would change positions, and they would open the curtains, and everyone was still and closed. So they would just do this over and over. So you got to see a lot of naked women in a lot of different poses, but technically they weren't moving. So we have been inventing sort of ways around this from the beginning. So another question that tends to come up when we think about erotic dancing is whether it's an art form. Again, historically it has been considered an art form, although sometimes solely for legal reasons. Because if you claim you're making art instead of making, pornography, then people will have to allow you to do it. So in various points of time, it has been considered an art form, and today some people even consider strip pole dancing a sport. It does take an extraordinary amount of muscle and coordination, so I think it might be a sport, but whether or not it's a sport has a lot to do with how sexy we think it is. So modern strip clubs have a lot of regulations in place. Very often there are laws regarding nudity, but they change by state, so sometimes the dancers can be fully nude, sometimes not. Very often there are laws about alcohol in the same place where people are being nude. Typically they do go together, people like that, but in some states they want them to be totally separate. So where the strip clubs are has a lot to do with the laws that are in place in the state or town or municipality that you're talking about. So for instance, in modern strip clubs, there tends to be a lot of laws about touching, about distance, because in part, any act of stripping is considered public nudity. So very often you might notice that strip clubs can't be within a certain amount of feet of like a school or a church or a public library. This is kind of interesting because one thing that we do know from studies is that there's actually a lower rate of violence in the immediate radius of strip clubs than there is further away. There's also a lower rate of sexual assault in the immediate radius of strip clubs than there are in places further away. So it could be that having strip clubs makes your people calm and nice. Maybe not, but it's an interesting argument. So modern strip clubs do tend to vary based on their laws, including touching, including privacy, but it is still a huge business. So we estimate that strip clubs make about $8 billion a year in America alone, and there's probably a little more than 3,000 of them currently operating. Most strip clubs feature women, but some strip clubs feature men. Most of the strip clubs that feature men are actually designed for gay men. Female customers tend to be problematic. They're usually drunk and they get kind of handsy. And very often they come in large groups as part of like a bridal party or a birthday or something like that. So ironically, male dancers tend to not like female customers. But it's still a sort of resurging art form itself. There are a lot of groups that tour around. You've probably seen movies about it lately. So it is something that we do continue to see happening. The rise of the male dancer. That said, most people think of women when they think of dancers. And one thing that I do want to make clear is that it's a very, very difficult job, and it's a very difficult lifestyle. People make a lot of jokes about just dropping out of school to be a stripper, and it's true. Strippers make more money than teachers. But it's very hard on your body, it's hard on your time, because it mostly occurs in the middle of the night. It can be hard on your family, it can be hard on your reputation, and it can really damage your ability to make healthy emotional relationships. So if you're considering dropping out of school to become a stripper, I might advise against it, but not for ethical reasons, but because of the impact that it might have on the rest of your life. Generally, people don't recommend it because it tends to have a pretty short shelf life. The other thing that I wanted to show you is that there tends to be a relationship between location and strip clubs. This is a map that has bigger bubbles depending on how many clubs are in the immediate area, and you'll notice that there are trends. For instance, there are a lot of strip clubs in Nevada and in California, also in Miami. You can see Georgia and Atlanta there for a little bit. You can see New York. So strip clubs do tend to vary with where the people are. You're not going to put something like this somewhere where no one has money to spend. But one of the things that's really interesting about this is that strip clubs tend to follow male occupations. So you'll see a lot of strip clubs outside of a place that is kind of low population if the population consists mostly of men who have recently made a lot of money. So it's pretty popular to have a strip club right outside of a place that does logging, for instance, or mining or oil rigging. Even though the population is low, the amount of men with money to spend is high. So once again, this is a very old art form that is constantly finding new ways to reinvent itself. Next, let's move into some products that are designed to make sex even better. Even though sex is perfectly fun all by itself, people have been trying for millennia to figure out ways to make it more fun, to use toys, to use enhancement. So we're going to talk about some of the things that we've created in an effort to make sex as good as possible. So let's start with sex toys. So this is kind of a loose definition. It can include all sorts of things that you might use during sex. But one thing that's super interesting about it is that people have been making sex toys out of whatever was available for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So some of the early sex toys were made out of things like bones and tusks, sometimes even wood. These pictures that you can see here at the bottom left are from Kenzie's own personal collection. In more recent years, we've been making toys out of more and more refined materials. Plastic, silicone, and these days they can do all sorts of things. They can vibrate, they can warm. Basically, anytime we get technology, part of what we do with it is put it into sex toys. One of the interesting things about sex toys is that even though the material changes, what we make with it tends to be pretty consistent. For instance, you might have seen in the last slide that there were just infinite variations on dildos. We also now have infinite variations on pretend human bodies. So you've probably seen the old classic, the inflatable doll. These days, people have used more and more technology to make increasingly realistic human bodies. You've probably heard of Real Dolls, which is the most famous company, but they are incredibly advanced in terms of the materials that they use and the science that they use to make the dolls as pleasurable as possible. We also see lots of variations on what is essentially a penis sleeve. This is designed for male masturbation, and one of the most famous examples right now, the fleshlight. I do love a pun. The other most popular selling toy for women is vibrators. Typically, women do like clitoral stimulation. Most women can orgasm from that. So there is also a huge variety of vibrators available, from the ones that are less than $10 to this one that is gold-plated. One of the things that's really interesting about having this variety of toys is the way that they've become more and more socially acceptable. So for instance, you might have seen sex toys being sold at scary, scary roadside stores. This is how people used to have to do it. Then there was a rise in making the stores more approachable. They became more friendly, more well lit. You might see examples like Good Vibrations or Toys in Babeland. But basically, like every other industry, it has largely turned online. So these days, the majority of people do get their sex toys from an online environment, but there are still a lot of interesting options for getting them in person. For instance, you might have noticed that some of the big box stores, like Walmart or Target, are starting to sell sex toys right out in the aisle. If you look next to the condoms, you might see vibrators, you might see light BDSM toys like these blindfolds, or even worse, you might have recently been invited to a party where someone is trying to sell you sex toys. There's been a huge rise, especially this company called Pure Romance, which is basically just a multi-level marketing scheme, but it's an interesting suggestion that if people are willing to invite you to this party, people that you work with, people that you go to church with, then there must be a certain acceptability of purchasing sex-related products. They wouldn't make it a communal event unless it was in some way okay. On a personal note, I don't recommend that you get involved in pyramid schemes because they are unethical, but it's still nice to see that they're out there in the world and people are advocating for a healthy exploration of sexuality. Next, let's talk about supplements and enhancements. So humans have been trying to eat foods and herbs and medicines to enhance their sex lives for millennia, of course, but what we consume does tend to change with the technology available. So for instance, you've probably heard of aphrodisiacs, food that is supposed to put you in the mood for sex. Often we talk about this with like oysters or sometimes even strawberries. And the thing that's kind of interesting about aphrodisiacs is that of course there's not really a chemical relationship to making you feel more sexual, but sometimes the placebo works. So if you spend the whole night eating foods that are supposed to help you feel sexual, you might gradually start to feel more sexual because the setting is right. So even though oysters probably won't do anything, it might not hurt. We also have a lot of versions of enhancements that are basically just herbs. Over the course of history, we've used things like horny goat weed, which is a great name, again designed to help people get in the mood. This is especially interesting in terms of gender. So female enhancement tends to be kind of a small business. Male enhancement, on the other hand, generates about $11 billion a year around the world. So let's talk about why this might be. So first, let's think about the ways that we associate masculinity with sexuality. This is something that we'll talk about a lot in more detail later, but basically when we talk about supplements and enhancements, part of what we're selling is the idea that the sex that you're having is not good enough, and often that your penis is not good enough. So very similar to the way that we body shame people, we're kind of penis shaming people into believing that they need drugs to make themselves better, or to make the sex better, or to make their erection last longer. So very often there's sort of a tie-in between erectile dysfunction especially and masculinity. A lot of ads point at the idea that you are not enough of a man, or that you are not satisfying your partner. And even if this isn't true, it can make people very, very concerned. So what we end up seeing is a huge range of male enhancement pills. And again, they go back from things that were just herbs, natural Viagra, to things that are basically just adrenaline, like what's in those 72-hour horse pills, or Viagra itself. So Viagra was invented on accident. Basically, they were testing heart medication, but what happens is that it blocks the blood flow back out of the penis. So it does not give you an erection, it does not make it necessarily harder or fuller, but if you believe it will help, it might. And if you have an actual medical condition, it might. So male enhancement pills and supplements and herbs are a huge business, and it's largely tied to our sociological perspective, which is important to remember. On the flip side of this, female enhancement. Now, female enhancement is a small business. This tends to not be a very big thing at all. So here are some examples of products that you might have seen for sale. So they range from things that are supplements, mostly just vitamins, to creams that are meant to sort of stimulate blood flow. Those can be very dangerous, don't put menthol anywhere down there. To things like pills that are, once again, mostly just caffeine. So most of the enhancement we see is designed for men because it's assumed that women are somehow already good enough, which is another really interesting sociological aspect. So finally, we come to prostitution, which is perhaps the most literal example of selling sex. So the technical definition of prostitution is this: providing or receiving sexual acts by specific arrangement between client and sex worker, sometimes involving a manager or a pimp. So basically, in regard to prostitution, it's one person selling sex to another person. Occasionally, there is a kind of intermediary. This is often done for safety reasons or sometimes just for profit reasons. But the basic premise here is that you are directly selling sex from one person to the next person. So sometimes prostitution is called the world's oldest profession. And this is true in a lot of ways. The thing that's important about realizing why this might be true is that it has a lot to do with the place of women in society. So in a lot of cultures where women weren't educated or where they weren't allowed to work outside the home, prostitution might be the only job they could get. It doesn't require any education and it doesn't require any real skills, although it does require certain skills to be good at it. But basically, it's referred to as the oldest profession because for a lot of women, it was the only profession. Now that said, it does go back thousands and thousands of years. We have records of prostitutes working in Samaria in 2400 BCE. We have paintings of people engaging in prostitution all over the world in caves and as pieces of art. And as far as we can tell, this is one job that happens in almost every civilization. So each civilization deals with it a little bit differently, and that's one of the things that we'll talk about. But it is worth noting that almost nothing else in the world occurs every civilization, but this does. So prostitution is legal in some places and illegal in other places, which can get super complicated. So first, let's look at this map of the whole world. Here, the green places are where prostitution is both legal and regulated. So that means that very often the working prostitutes will have to have health checks, and they'll have to pay taxes and that sort of thing. In the blue places, it is legal to participate in prostitution, but it's not necessarily regulated. So it is legal to work on a case-by-case basis, but there's not necessarily that same sort of economic or safety regulation. In the red places, prostitution is straight up illegal, and then of course in the gray places, we don't know. So basically, how we feel about the legality of prostitution does change culturally. In America, of course, it's illegal, except for a few places in Nevada. So this is kind of an interesting thing, but in Nevada, counties can decide on a county-by-county level. Interestingly, the county that contains Las Vegas does not allow for prostitution. It's mostly in some sort of smaller, more rural places, so you have to really drive out there. Most of the time in America, it's illegal because we find it to be immoral. So it really was legal up until 1910, and a lot of our most famous cities were basically founded by prostitutes, like San Francisco. But after a while, we decided that it should be illegal, which was mostly based on our Victorian values, and there's a lot of talk about whether it will soon legalize once again. So that's an interesting thing to keep your eye on, because some people are arguing that sex workers deserve the same protection as every other kind of worker. So in America, we have a few primary concerns. Definitely there's the moral aspect, but there's also the safety aspect. For instance, we know that trafficking is very dangerous, and we'll talk about that. We know that drug use is high among women who are sex workers, and that can lead to coercion on behalf of their pimps or managers. We also know that it can be a public health issue. The military was one of the first sort of social institutions to deal with prostitution by giving their soldiers not just condoms, but also penicillin, because prostitutes and soldiers do tend to travel together. As prostitution has been on the rise in different places around the world, sometimes they do change their public health concerns in terms of giving away condoms or trying to protect the sex workers themselves. So there are health concerns in addition to moral concerns in America. So even though the potential for earning is high, it's worth noting that prostitution is the most dangerous job in America. We think of jobs that are traditionally masculine being more dangerous, like logging or ice road fishing, but technically more people die participating in prostitution than in any other profession in America right now. There's also a huge risk of being physically assaulted. Very often, prostitutes are seen as sort of on the edges of society, and especially on the edges of legality. So there's this assumption that if you physically assault a prostitute, nothing bad will happen to you because they were committing a crime. Speaking of which, when you engage in prostitution, you, as a prostitute, would be committing a crime, but so too would your client be committing a crime. We forget this often because we tend to let loose the people who are buying the prostitute, but basically we spend a lot of money every year arresting and processing prostitution charges. So basically we arrest maybe 70 or 80,000 prostitutes and their clients a year, on which we spend $200 million a year. But I want you to notice that we arrest the prostitutes far more often than we arrest their clients. So if you look at this graph, you'll notice that the vast majority of people arrested in relation to prostitution are female prostitutes. The second most popular are the male prostitutes, but the smallest category of all, the clients. And this is especially interesting because to commit this crime, you need two people. You cannot just be a prostitute if you're not selling anything. So the fact that we arrest so many of the people engaged in one side of this, but not very many of the people engaged in the other side of this, is an excellent example of the way that we think about power, especially in regard for women and sex work. It's also worth noting that there are a lot of levels of prostitution. Very often, we think of the sort of street-level prostitute, the person who's literally physically on the streets. They tend to make the least amount of money, probably less than $20,000 a year, but there's also a really high incidence of drug use among street-level prostitutes. The next level up would be kind of the call girl. Typically, they'll have a place where they operate and the clients will come to them. And the next level up, of course, the escort. And they make a lot of money, much more money than anyone who's ever taught you makes. And this is still illegal, but they are the least likely to be caught. In part because they tend to be extremely discreet and they're not on the streets, but also in part because we just simply don't punish wealthy people the same way we punish everyone else. As a point of interest, this particular escort was punished because she was taken across state lines over the course of her job. So remember, if you do decide to engage a prostitute, don't cross state lines with them because that's a felony. In America, the only current legal form of prostitution takes place in brothels. And this is done at least in part for the safety of the sex workers themselves. So a brothel is basically the house, they used to literally be houses, where a lot of sex workers are working at the same time. So typically you'll come in, you'll get to have a look at everyone who's currently working, pick your favorite, and then negotiate prices. So typically the prostitutes are themselves independent contractors, so the brothels aren't allowed to list prices, because the women, or men, can charge as much as they want based on each client, so basically there's not a consistent price. But the thing that's really nice about brothels is that they check the health of the people who work there. So anyone who's engaged in selling sex at a brothel has to do regular medical checkups, including regular STI screenings. So the odds that a person who is working there is actually healthier than a random stranger on the street are surprisingly high. The question of whether this will continue to be legal in other parts of America, again, is a pressing issue that we just don't know how it'll work out. Another kind of prostitution that's weirdly sort of on the rise is male prostitution. So typically when we think of male prostitution, we think of men who are servicing women, but it's actually much more common for male prostitutes to be engaged in servicing men. So there becomes this question of whether if you have a sexual act with another man, are you gay? Is gay for pay okay? Do you have to be gay to enjoy something like that? So these are also kind of interesting social questions. But the thing is, the majority of male prostitutes service men because there is this expectation that women don't have to pay. And this is true, in a sense. If you lower your standards enough, someone will probably have sex with you. But one of the things that women are often paying for is a specific kind of body type or a specific kind of service. So there are fewer male prostitutes than there are female prostitutes, but that might be another one of the things that's going to be changing. One of the sad things about prostitution, especially in regard to illegal sex work, is that the same types of people tend to go into sex work. So very often it's women from the lowest rungs of the economic ladder, regardless of which country they're in. Very often it's women who are already sexually active. Almost no one loses their virginity as a prostitute, although people do occasionally sell their virginity over and over. Most of the time, though, it's people who are already sexually active and already addicted to drugs. So very often, when we ask prostitutes about their previous life before engaging in sex work, we see a lot of recurring themes. So for instance, let's look at these graphs. In this first graph, we're measuring the first time that something happened versus how regularly it happens now. So for instance, you'll notice that among prostitutes, their first instance of drug use was young, usually about 15 and a half, but they are regularly using drugs by the time they're 17 and a half. Similarly, their first sexual activity was often around age 16, but their first act of prostitution was often around age 20. So very often, what ends up happening is that women who are already engaged in, quote, risky behaviors end up doing them professionally. Very often, prostitutes get into sex work to support their drug habit. In this next graph, we're measuring sex workers against people who haven't done sex work to see if there's any difference in regard to the first time they did something. So for instance, you'll notice that the first consensual sex among people who became prostitutes later was younger than the first consensual sex among people who've never engaged in sex work. And the same is true about the regular sexual activity that the people who are working engage in versus the people who are not working. But one especially sad fact is that you'll notice that the first penile penetration tends to occur earlier in prostitutes versus the comparison group. And that's not to do with sex that someone agreed to. That's not consensual penile penetration. That's very often rape. So it does tend to flow together that people who engage in sex work have been sexually abused at a young age. This is one of the biggest problems in regard to illegal sex work and, of course, in regard to our mental health state in America. It's also important to remember that prostitution can't exist without clients. So the typical client of prostitutes is exactly what you saw in Pretty Woman. They tend to be middle-aged, middle or upper class. They tend to identify as heterosexual regardless of the gender of the prostitute they're working with, and they're usually married. So if you ask clients of prostitutes why they chose to pay for sex, typically they have really similar answers. One is just a sudden urge. They often argue that it's not premeditated. The second is that they want to try something new and different, maybe even something that their partner does not want to participate in. And the final version is, of course, that they are unsatisfied in their partnership. This is usually the case with people who are middle-aged in the middle of their marriage. Are these reasons the real reasons? Hard to say, right? This is one of those things that can be very difficult to interview people about. But it's important to remember that when we think of prostitutes, very often we think of really low-class individuals. But when we think of their clients, we think of relatively middle-class, respectable individuals, even though they're participating in exactly the same crime. The final aspect of prostitution that I wanted to address is sex trafficking. Now, it's important to note that sex trafficking and prostitution are actually very different. Most prostitutes are willingly engaging in their work. A lot of them are consenting to what's happening. However, everyone who is sex trafficked is not consenting. None of them meant to become sex workers, none of them want to be sex workers, and most of the time the only reason that they're engaging in sex work is because they don't have any other options. They're typically far from home, very often they've had their passports taken away, they don't know anybody, they might not speak the language, and so because of all of the things that are stacked against them, they find themselves participating in sex work. So the technical definition for sex trafficking is the illegal trade of humans for the purposes of sexual exploitation. Typically, they're taken from one country to another country, and again, they don't get the profit from this, someone else does. The profit can be substantial. We estimate that sex trafficking accounts for $10 billion in revenue a year, and it's something that we're beginning to see the police and really even the airport security cracking down on. So the issue often with sex trafficking is that in addition to just exploiting people who didn't know they'd be part of this, it very often exploits the very weakest members of society. So of course women and children, but also again the poorest women and children, or the most homeless women and children, or people who thought that they were going to be refugees. If we look at this map, we can see that there are certain countries where people who are being sex trafficked typically originate, and certain countries where people who are being sex trafficked end up. So you'll notice that a lot of the countries of origin tend to be relatively poor, or they tend to be overpopulated, or they tend to be experiencing war or famine, whereas the countries where they tend to end up have a higher GDP, typically a higher standard of living, and a lot more people who don't have to do sex work. So there is a direct relationship in regard to sex trafficking between where people are taken from and where they end up. There's also a direct relationship in terms of what kind of jobs they might end up having. So most of the time, people who are sex trafficked end up in prostitution, sometimes stripping, any other kind of sex services. Sometimes they end up in domestic service, which is typically maids or cleaners and the like, and then sometimes they end up in other kinds of jobs. But basically, it's a very hard life to escape from, because you're facing so many disadvantages, from the language to the money to the possible drug use, because it's very common to give sex-trafficked women and children drugs in order to get them addicted so that it's harder for them to leave. So again, sex trafficking is a very different crime than prostitution, and a much less immoral one, and one that we're only just beginning to address as a country. So our final questions of the day have to do with earning. The first thing that I think is important to think about is who profits. Remember, in sociology, very often we ask who benefits when we're looking at any specific social phenomenon, but here we can literally say who profits. So this is an important thing to think about. Whenever you see pornography, for instance, or dancing, who is the person who is taking home the profits? And second, what are the social impacts of the commercialization of sex? Does internet pornography change the way that we have sex? Would legal sex work change the kind of jobs that are available to us? Why do we act like people who have participated in sex work are worse than people who haven't? All of these are important questions, and I look forward to discussing them with you. So as always, if you have any questions, send me an email, and I'll see you next time.